It has been leaked which of the 6 brawlers will receive the next 6 hypercharges on the next update, but we still have no idea how will they look, and that's exactly why I'm here. Just to clarify, I always go over abilities instead of stat increases, so do not go crazy if I ask for some pretty wild abilities. So without further ado, let's start with our first brawler, Barley. For Barley, I have kind of a complex idea actually. So, all of his attacks and the super, whenever an enemy even touches them, they will receive a burning effect that will deal 50% of the damage. So, all of your attacks will just apply burning to the enemies, which would obviously make the super and his basic attack a lot more area control-ish in a certain way, which obviously is something very good for Barley. And on top of that, not only they damage enemies over time, as they also heal your allies over time and yourself. The same way that if your enemies touch the super puddles or the basic attack, they start burning. Your allies, if they touch them, they start healing. The same amount, 50% of the damage that they would kinda, because they're allies, receive. And on top of that, your super would now have 4 extra bottles. One at the top, one at the bottom, one at the left, and one at the right. So your super not only would be a lot stronger in terms of area control, as it would also be a lot wider, which would obviously help Barley so much. On top of that, the rate for this hypercharge would be around 40%, which means that you would need 2.5 supers. Feels fair enough for me because the hypercharge also affects your basic attack, so it's not that you really need the super to activate the hypercharge, which is a really good thing. And lastly, and very important, some stat increases. You deal 15% bonus damage and 15% bonus speed. So Barley, it is, I will also say, poorly statted, so that's the reason why I'm actually even giving these buffs. And trust me when I say that this is the most amount of stat increases that a character will receive in one of these hypercharge videos, I can guarantee you. Next on the list we have Angela, and for Angela I have already seen this idea thousands of times, and honestly it would just be a waste of potential because I absolutely love this. Your super, while you are hypercharged, your super would follow you. So while you are hypercharged, your super would just follow you. You would always have that poisoning area following you, and you would deal the bonus poison damage, which would obviously be very helpful. On top of that, while you are hypercharged, whenever you use the super it will be around 30% larger. I don't know exactly the size of the super either way. It will be around 30% larger, and the super will also summon around 5 tiny shields. Imagine these like Melody's notes spinning around her, but they actually have HP and they are meant to protect you, not to damage the enemy. So, if you used your super while you were hypercharged, not only you would have a larger super, a super that also follows you, as the super would also protect you from incoming hits, which would obviously also help Angelo dealing with assassins, assuming that he will receive some sort of nerf, because honestly, it's kinda hard to make a good hypercharge for a brawler that's already broken. So yeah. And on top of that, this hypercharge would be a 40% rate, so it would not be very easily cyclable. You would need around 5 full shots or more if the super rate actually gets nerfed, which I do hope so. And lastly, there won't be a single stat increase. No bonus damage, no bonus speed, and no bonus shield, because he does not need it. He is the sniper with the highest HP, the highest damage, and the highest movement speed. So in my opinion, the super, actually the hypercharge utility by itself, it is already powerful enough, at least in my view. Next on the list we have Gale, and oh boy, I am excited about this one. It has been a hot minute since Gale even was usable in the meta. His second support can be nice, but honestly I never see Gale being used, so this hypercharge better be good, and I can assure you that I did my best. So, when you click on the hypercharge button, you would execute your super in a 360 degree. So When you click on the hypercharge button, you would just spread your super all over around. But that kinda super would have half of the range. And yes, if you have the first star power, and if that person goes against a wall or a river, they would get stunned. And on top of that, while you are a hypercharge, your super would deflect projectiles. Imagine these like Buster's super, but it is only while you are hypercharged, and to make this even helpful, it would definitely need to reflect the entirety of the damage, because the super lasts like half a second. So if you can only deflect like, I don't know, one projectile at best from a Piper for example, you should at least deflect the whole damage back. And against multiple shooters, then there would be no problem because they would be deflected back less damage. And on top of that, against assassins or close range enemies like El Primo for example, most of the times the super even interrupts their attacks, so it would not make much sense for them. So I would really expect this ability to reflect all of the damage as the same projectile. I don't know how hard it would be to actually implement that, because I would really expect that to happen to Buster, but it doesn't, so I hope to see that on Gale. And lastly, has a tiny extra, Gale's super now also slows the enemies for half a second. You do not need to hit a wall or anything, you just straight up slow them down for 1.5 seconds. That simple. And this hypercharge would have a rate of 50%, so it would be very easy to cycle because you don't really have any stat increases at all as well. I don't really feel like Gale needs any stat increases. He has a lot of HP, he deals a lot of damage. Maybe he could have had a movement speed increase, but you have the first gadget. If you want agility, you can just use it. So I really hope that this hypercharge brings back some excitement to Gale, and that 360 half range super should do the trick together with deflecting projectiles with the super. Next we have AMS, and for AMS I decided to go a little bit more simplistic. So while you are hypercharged, your super will not only slow people down, as it would also silence enemies inside for 0.25 seconds, so trust me, as soon as you leave the zone you are unsilenced, and people inside her zone also reload their ammo 50% slower. Also, she would get a 20% movement speed increase, so she could easily approach people. So, I personally am not a fan of the idea of just straight up increasing her super range somehow. I feel like that is just way too cheesy, because yes, it would definitely make her stronger, but for me it just feels like not the right move to, and it's very boring. How many supers are just straight up larger? So the movement speed increase should kinda fix that, so that AMS could actually approach people to use the super on them. Because your super silences enemies, you can just go straight to them and absolutely destroy them, because they're silenced, they cannot attack. So that combination of extra movement speed and a very aggressive super should allow AMS while hypercharged to do some really aggressive plays. And because of the potential that the hypercharge has, I would make the rate a 40% rate. So you would need 2.5 supers. It would not be easy to charge, but it would not be hard as well. I feel like it is a very balanced hypercharge, and AMS absolutely deserves something like this. Next on the list we have Frank. So because we already know that Frank will receive a rework, actually I made a video talking about that rework. You can check it out at the top of the video if you want to after this video, please. So because of that rework, the hypercharge could be literally anything, but because I don't think that they will change too much the hypercharge, I feel like this is what they will most likely do, and what I also want. So straight up, while you are hypercharged, you are immune to stuns, slows, and knockbacks. This by itself, it is the stat increase, because Frank will not get any extra speed or damage or shield. This resistance to knockbacks and everything will be his stat increase in a certain way. And on top of that, at the end of his super, while he's hypercharged, his super would summon 5 shockwaves that would bounce off walls, and that they would have half the range of a BB bubble, for example, and those shockwaves, they would slow enemies down. So the main idea is that Frank would just send a massive wave throughout the entirety of the map, and because those shockwaves only deal half the damage, have half the range, and they don't even stun, they just slow for 2 seconds. I don't think that the hypercharge would be way too broken. But because Frank can cycle his super incredibly fast, I will make the hypercharge rate 25%. So he would need 4 supers in total to get the hypercharge. But because his super is just straight up so easy to get, for me it feels pretty darn fair that the hypercharge is at least somewhere challenging to achieve. And finally, we have Piper. Honestly, I have been thinking about this one for a very long time, and even most of the community does not know exactly what they want for Piper. So because I do not follow the regular hypercharge idea, this is no problem for me. So be open-minded, because this one is gonna be the weirdest of them all. So number 1, the hypercharge will last for a total of 10 seconds. It will make sense in the end, I promise. And while hypercharged, Piper would have an area around her that would have 8.33 tiles of radius. So it is the same range or radius as Charles' range, which just for you to have an idea of how large that area is. And enemies inside that area, they will start to have a circle being filling up, kinda like Lu's basic attack in a certain way, kinda very similar to that mechanic. So while enemies are inside of that area, they start to get calmed down by Piper's presence in a certain way, and that circle will get filled by 12.5% per second. So if you're inside that area for 7 seconds, which it is fairly easier to avoid, but the area is very large, so that also makes Piper a little bit more defensive with this ability as well. So for each second you get 12.5% calm. But for what does calm mean even? So for each 1% of calm that you have, your reload speed will be slower by 1%. This by itself, it's not menacing at all. We already saw that reloading nerfs like Willow's first gadget or Lu's original second gadget, they usually don't work. But it's not just that. Enemies that have at least 35% calm, they will deal 15% less damage. Enemies that have at least 55% calm, they are 15% slower. Enemies that have at least 75% calm, they cannot charge their supers, and enemies that are at least 90% calmed, they are silenced. So, lots and lots of area control to Piper. You could kill her very easily because this hypercharge does not grant her any stat increases. She is as vulnerable as she has always been, unless she has the super, of course. But that area around her just simply allows for your entire team to just kinda push forward in case the enemy team is being very aggressive. It would be, in my opinion, a very solid hypercharge. And the final detail that I also really want to see, kinda having something relating to her super, whenever Piper lands with a super on the spot where she lands, she would kinda execute a little bit of Guz super effect. So where she lands, it just pushes enemies away. This would also make slightly easier for Piper to kinda get a nice position in the map, to reposition herself so that she can get the effect of the hypercharge calming the enemy down a lot easier. So I think that this hypercharge would be actually really strong. So I would give it a rate of 35%. So you would need 2.85 supers. Piper's super is not necessarily the easiest to get, so it's not the hardest as well. So I feel like a 35% rate feels fair enough for me. And honestly, from all of the hypercharges that I've ever made, this is for sure the most complex I've ever done. And there you have it, all of my ideas for the newest hypercharges. It is not exactly 100% confirmed that these will be the brawlers to receive the HyperCharges, but they appeared in some of the Brawl Stars YouTube channel most recent videos with the HyperCharge icon, so I am pretty sure that they will receive one. And as I said, I am more of a ability kind of person than the stat increases, so I know that my HyperCharge ideas are very uncommon, but I still really appreciate them and I would really like to know your opinion. Write in comments down below, trust me, I will read them, and I'll see you on the next video.